Good afternoon. My name is Pastor Brett, and thanks for joining me for today's Lunchtime Devo. I'd like to take a quick look at the biblical character of Joshua. A friend and I have been studying Joshua, and he's an interesting guy. He's Moses' assistant. He's often referred to as Joshua the son of Nun, which is just a way of helping keep him straight from all the other Joshuas, I guess. A common verse that we think of with Joshua is Joshua 1:9. And in that verse, maybe it's familiar to you, it says, "Haven't I commanded you, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So continuing on in the book of Joshua, you know that right after that, there are spies that are sent into Jericho. They go to Rahab, of course, and that whole story. And then eventually the whole Israelite crew crosses the Jordan, and you just see him conquering and taking over the promised land, and you think, man, this Joshua, he was just, this verse just seemed to propel him into all this amazing work. But I want to kind of back up a little bit in his life. Not too long before that, in Deuteronomy Chapter 31, we actually see in verse 6, Moses at this point is, talking, and he said these words to all Israel, but which he started in verse 2, but I'm going to jump in here in Deuteronomy 31:6. Moses says to all Israel, "Be strong and courageous." Sound familiar? "Don't be terrified or afraid of them." Still very familiar. "For the Lord your God is the one who will go with you. He will not leave you or abandon you." Moses then summoned Joshua, so now he's talking directly to Joshua, and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you will go with this people into the land the Lord swore to give to their fathers. You will enable them to take possession of it. The Lord is the one who will go before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or abandon you. Do not be afraid or discouraged." So first Moses was talking to all Israel, and then Moses talked directly to Joshua, said the same thing. And then even a little farther on in chapter 31, so Deuteronomy 31:23 says, "The Lord commissioned Joshua, son of Nun, be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land I swore to them, and I will be with you." And then even in Joshua chapter 1, I read verse 9, that's kind of the most famous one, but even in verse 6, God is telling Joshua, be strong and courageous in verse 6. And then in verse 7, "Above all, be strong and very courageous to observe carefully the whole instruction my servant Moses commanded you." And so, we just see this being repeated. I mean, this is within a fairly short time frame. In Deuteronomy, Moses is still alive, and by the time the book of Joshua starts, Moses has passed on. But this was a guy who started out as a slave in Egypt, and then he went through the parting of the Red Sea, and then he was one of the 12 spies who went to scope out the promised land, and he came back. Him and Caleb said, "Yeah, we can take it." The other 10 said, "No, we can't." So that's why they ended up having to wander around in the desert for 40 years. So he went through those times, but yet he still seemed to need a lot of encouragement. Encouragement directly from God, directly from Moses. And I haven't studied all through Joshua yet, but he didn't seem to be one to make mistakes. At least they don't record him where he would need encouragement. Moses, hit the rock, and that's why he couldn't go into the promised land. I don't know if Joshua has any of those type of black eyes on his resume, but still, there seemed to be this need to repeat to Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, for I will be with you always." And so I guess I would just encourage us, if God's repeating something to us, it might be that we need it, or it might be that God just wants to repeat it. Maybe we need to change, maybe we need to switch course, maybe we need to learn something new, or maybe God just wants to keep encouraging us to do the right thing as he did with Joshua. And so I also just think about how Joshua was, his preparation to get to this point. Like I said, we get to Joshua 1, and we kind of think this is the beginning of Joshua because this is where, his name starts the book. But man, his life, God had been preparing him through all those other things, through being the slave in Egypt, through going through the Red Sea. I forgot to mention earlier, he was also the one, he looked after the tent of meeting when they were in the wilderness, in the desert. They had the tabernacle set up, but then they would have the tent of meeting, they had the camp set up, and the tent of meeting was outside the camp. And that's where Moses would commune with God, and Joshua was the one that looked after that when Moses wasn't there. So he'd been around a long time, and so I don't know where you're at in your life, but honestly, whether you're a kid, young, or whether you're teenagers, midlife, later life, God seems to have a way of preparing us for what we need next and growing us along the way to get there. And so I guess just be encouraged that God has a plan. We know that God has a plan, and we trust that. I just encourage us with that today. Also, here's an interesting thought. God said this to Joshua in Joshua 1:9, and is this something that we can cling to today? Is this a promise to us? And I'd say no. God was talking to Joshua. This was very specific to him. So we can't cling to this verse in particular. But on the other hand, Jesus did repeat quite a bit of this verse in the New Testament. And so I think we can cling to those things. So I think of, the end of the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verse 20, is where Jesus says, "And remember, I will be with you always to the very end of the age." And, then in John 14, he's talking to his disciples. This is the last week of his life. And he says, "Don't let your heart be troubled." And they were going to go through some troubling times coming up. And so I do think those apply to us. And anyway, I just encourage you, whatever, turmoil you're going through, God's preparing you right now for what he has prepared for you in the future. And yes, we can also cling to Joshua 1:9. He wants us to be encouraged. He wants us to take courage, and he will be with us to the end of the age. And so with that, God bless you. Go with that truth today. And live in the power of God being with us at all times. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.